Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you cordially to today's event, Sustaining Biodiversity, a Challenge for Science and Politics. My name is Victor Bruckmann, and here at the Academy of Sciences I'm in charge of various things, among other things for the two institutions, the Commission for Interdisciplinary Ecological Studies and the Austrian IIasa Council. I am in charge of the management of both institutions here at the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and I have the pleasure and the honor to welcome you and to guide you through this evening. We are discussing a topic that is very important to me. Before we start with our agenda, I would like to provide you with some preliminary information. First, I'm very pleased that we have a large turnout. Owing to the pandemic, of course, it has been a bit difficult to meet personally, face-to-face, and I would like to thank you for your interest. I would like to thank you for having found your way to the Academy. And, of course, I would also like to welcome our numerous participants who are connected via the live stream. They are connected online. That's the majority of participants who are connected online. And I guess this is the way we're going to organize events in future, I guess. We also have simultaneous interpretation into German and English. What this means for us is that we need to speak clearly and distinctly. This is important, especially during the discussion where you'll have a chance to participate. But what's even more important is to use a microphone, because otherwise simultaneous interpretation is not going to work. But now let us start with our agenda. I would like to introduce the first speaker of this evening. A very, very cordial welcome indeed to Albert van Jaarsveld.
Albert is Director General of the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IIasa. That institute celebrates its 50th anniversary this year with a range of different events and activities, such as today's discussion on sustaining biodiversity. Albert is the 11th Director General of IIasa since its foundation in 1972. And prior to joining IIasa, Albert served as Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And he was also President and Chief Executive Officer of the African National Research Foundation. He will introduce you to IIasa and provide the foundation for today's event by explaining the background of this event. Albert, the floor is yours.
Albert, bitte. Sie haben das Wort.
Thank you very much, Victor. Much appreciated, the kind introduction. From my side, I'd like to just also extend a warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for taking the time to come and talk to us about important matters like biodiversity. Sorry, I was just told to take my mask off. So, okay, there we go. Thank you very much. I'll do so. And so from my side, we're really delighted that we can have this opportunity to talk about biodiversity together with the Austrian Academy of Sciences, who's our co-hosts for this evening. And thank you for Victor and Kristen Kurbel for organizing this particular event. Much appreciated. At this time of strife, I think it's also just opportune and the right thing to do for us to maybe take a moment of silence, if that's okay with everybody in the room, for all of those that have deceased in the brutal invasion of Ukraine that we all see every day on our screens, and to just share a moment of reflection and thoughts for those people whose lives have been destroyed by this ongoing activity. So with your permission, a moment's silence, please. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Okay. This evening, of course, is part, as you heard from Victor, part of a series of events to mark IIasa's 50th anniversary. We will be having these events together with our global partners, up to 15 events distributed around the globe to share with our partners what's happening at IIasa. But there are particularly two events that are noteworthy that I'd like to mention in Vienna, for those of you that can diarize them if possible. The first is an evening of science diplomacy, which I think is a very pertinent topic at this moment in time where we stand. What is the role of science diplomacy and what should it be in the context of conflict and disruptions for everybody involved? This will be held at the Museum Quarter in Vienna on the 14th of June. And then there's a second occasion together with the Austrian Academy of Sciences as well on the 16th and 17th of November in the Festsaal, just next door. And we'll be focusing on systems analysis, which is our core business at IIasa, but also this will be followed by a full-day symposium that's going to be focusing on systems analysis. So I'd like to invite all of those around that would like to attend these two events to please keep an eye open for them, and please, we look forward to seeing all of you there if possible. And this is going to be something that we look forward to and we will celebrate. But of course tonight we're talking biodiversity, and I think it's really important for us. We at IIasa feel strongly that biodiversity is one of those emerging existential threats that is going to affect humanity in the very near future. I think after the immediacy of the climate crisis that we all faced with, we must understand that biodiversity is probably going to be just around the corner as one of the major issues that we have to tackle. So that's why this is an important focus area for us at IIasa. It's a key part of our new IIasa strategy for this decade, and therefore I really look forward to the deliberations and discussions this evening. So thank you all that are participating, and I really look forward to what's going to happen this evening. Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you very much, Victor.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my pleasure to introduce Christian Köberl, who is not only the chairman of the co-organizing Austrian IIasa Council, but he also represents Austria and thus the national knowledge landscape in the IIasa Council. He's a member of the IIasa Council, and he is a full member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And at the same time, Christian Köberl is also a member of the Academy's Commission for Interdisciplinary Ecological Studies. And thus he also has an idea of biodiversity, which is the topic of this evening. Other than that, he is more concerned with extraterrestrial, but not living visitors to our Earth, namely meteorites and their consequences, namely the craters that these meteorites cause. But as we know, this is the link to biodiversity. These meteorites have already had a significant influence on the biodiversity of our planet, at least once. Christian, please. Thank you very much, Victor, for the kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I am standing here not so much as a scientist, but as a chairperson of the Austrian IIasa Council. The subject that we're going to discuss tonight is located somewhere between IIasa, the IIasa Council, the Commission for Interdisciplinary Ecological Studies, and other colleagues of the Academy, as a very important topic. because this is a topic which, in the sometimes very vociferous debate that is often held on Fridays, it is often forgotten. But as far as the significance and importance is concerned, as Albert said, in the long term, it may not only be relevant for life on Earth, but also for humans. When it comes to exercising our humanity here on Earth, maybe this is the biggest threat that we are faced with, because due to the fact that people tend to spread on this globe, and even though it is said in some religious writings that we should subjugate the Earth, but that doesn't mean that we should eradicate most of life on this Earth. And as Victor has just told us, 66 million years ago, there was a mass extinction on planet Earth, which affected not only the dinosaurs as the most well-known species back then, but also 70% of all known animal and plant species that existed back then. There was a large asteroid with a 10-kilometer diameter. The crater had a 200-kilometer radius and diameter. It is still preserved today. It is even covered by more recent minerals and rocks in the peninsula of Yucatan in Mexico. The impact was fatal, but today we have human asteroids, and we have the possibility of tackling the problems of loss of biodiversity in Central Europe, maybe in the area of insects, which is already quite remarkable, but we are trying to limit the impact. And this evening will be an important contribution to the discussion of the problem of a loss of biodiversity. And together with IIasa, we have managed to find distinguished speakers and participants in the discussion. I would like to wish you and all of us an interesting evening. Thank you. Thank you, Christian. And thus I'm pleased to introduce the presentation of Alice Vadreau. Alice Vadreau is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna, where her research interests include international environmental policy, biodiversity policy, or institutions that are at the interface between science and politics. International marine protection is particularly close to her heart, however, and thus you know why we have this cover photo on the invitation. She has made it her mission, and is a leading project in this field funded by the European Research Council, in which methods are being developed at the interface between science and politics in order to be able to protect the world's oceans sustainably. Alice has a direct connection to the Academy of Sciences, as she is a member of the Junge Akademie, a committee at the Academy consisting of excellent young scientists. Alice, you have the floor. Well, first of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the Commission for Interdisciplinary Ecological Studies at the OAW, the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and the Austrian IIasa Council for the invitation. And I would like to thank Victor for the kind words of introduction. It is a great honor for me to be able to address you on the occasion of this very special event, the 50th anniversary of the IIasa, the International Institute, and to address this meeting and to enrich the subsequent panel discussion with a lecture from my field of research on international environmental policy. While preparing my talk, I asked myself why it is a political science approach that interests you, or what contribution I can make with my research on the interface between science and politics in the field of international biodiversity policy. The answer I have found is that the political and public discussion about the decline of species has reached a point where we no longer need to talk about whether the loss of biodiversity is a reality or whether it can be scientifically proven and mapped or not. Rather, we should discuss whether the institutions and political and legal frameworks that we have created in order to deal with the loss of biodiversity, in order to be able to manage this crisis of loss of biodiversity, whether those are capable to formulate appropriate goals and measures in order to stop this decline of species. You will see in the course of my presentation that we nevertheless have to talk about scientific facts, about concepts and methods to measure the decline of species, because these cannot be discussed uncoupled and unhinged from political developments and in light of political decision-making processes. The fact that there is a broad scientific consensus on species decline is shown by the Global Assessment Report of the World Biodiversity Council, IPBES, which was adopted by more than 100 countries in 2019, and it highlights the dramatic loss of biodiversity and its causes and drivers, that is, direct as well as indirect drivers. Up to 1 million species are threatened with extinction, according to this report, and many of them already in the next few decades. That the extinction of species today is at least 10 to 100 times higher than the average of the last 10 million years is also evidenced by this report. It also shows that half of the world's living corals have disappeared since 1870, and that the global forest cover is only 68% compared to the pre-industrial era. This report also points to the fact that 75% of the land surface and 66% of the ocean surfaces have been altered by human activities. And one last scientific fact that I would like to present here is that more than 85% of wetlands have been lost in the last 300 years. Based on these findings, the authors of this global report concluded that important international targets, such as the Aichi biodiversity targets, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was supposed to have been achieved by 2020, have not been achieved, and that the achievements of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted in 2015, will not easily be reached. Let's take a look at the negotiations that took place in mid-March, so only 2 weeks ago, at the Convention on Biological Diversity in Geneva, where, among other things, the negotiation of a new post-2020 global biodiversity framework were at stake is enough to understand that the conservation of biodiversity constitutes a political challenge that is not easily enforceable, despite a scientifically underpinned need for rapid and ambitious political action. Among the 196 participating countries, in spite of 2 weeks of deliberations, there was no consensus how these milestones that are to be used to measure progress on the protection of biodiversity should be organized. I will come back to these negotiations in Geneva later in my presentation and use them as one of 3 examples for my analysis. But what I would like to say at this point is that a political science perspective is central to understanding where the political challenges for conservation of biodiversity lie on the one hand, and on the other hand, what the role of science has to be in this context, and why this, according to my hypothesis, is also ambivalent and political and can so easily become an object of dispute between states. I would like to illustrate this with 3 concrete examples and show how, why, and against the background of which political interests, science can become an object of dispute in international biodiversity policy. This has, of course, marked international biodiversity policies in the past 30 years. First, the World Biodiversity Council, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and The third example would be negotiations on a legally binding instrument on marine biodiversity in the high seas. And like Victor said, this is, of course, my current research subject, so I wanted to comment on that. The Convention on Biological Diversity is a convention of the United Nations that was negotiated in the course of the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, also known as the Earth Summit or Rio Conference in June of 1992, and which entered into force on the 29th of December of 1993. So the CBD, along with Agenda 21 and the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development and the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the CBD is considered a central achievement of international environmental policy. The establishment of the CBD marks the beginning of a 30-year history of regular conferences of the parties, or the COPs, which have had a significant impact on biodiversity policies. And this is also a central argument of my presentation here. It has also influenced the biodiversity research worldwide. There are several arguments for this. On the one hand, in the course of negotiating the text of the Convention on Biodiversity, which was drafted at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s by scientists, among others, in the circle of the IUCN, but also of UNESCO, a clarification of terms took place which contributed to the current definition of biodiversity along three levels.
The diversity of species, the diversity of different organisms in an ecosystem, ecosystem diversity itself, that is the diversity of different habitats for different organisms, but also the diversity of genes, that is the genetic diversity within a species or all species of an ecosystem. Specifically, Article 2 of the CBD
Biological diversity means the variability among living organisms from all sources, including inter alia terrestrial, marine and other aquatic ecosystems and the ecological complexes of which they are part. This includes diversity within species, between species and of ecosystems.
The reason for the new term and definition, that is the combination of biological diversity to biodiversity, is often explained with reference to the National Forum on Biodiversity 1986 in Washington, D.C. and the resulting conference proceedings Biodiversity, edited by Edward O. Wilson. In the foreword, he writes that biodiversity must increasingly become the focus of international politics, and that this would also require an effort on the part of science. It is necessary to go beyond intra-scientific debates about the theory and methodology of biodiversity research and contribute to policy-relevant knowledge so that the loss of biodiversity can be addressed at the international level. He has the following thesis on why the topic has become more important. You can also see it on the slide here.
This tension, which was evident by 1980 and had steadily picked up momentum by the time of the National Forum on Biodiversity, can be ascribed to two or more or less independent developments. The first was the accumulation of enough data on deforestation, species extinction and tropical biology to bring global problems into sharper focus and warrant broader public exposure. The second development was the growing awareness of the close linkages between the conservation of biodiversity and economic development. 10
years later, and this is the second work that you can see here, David Takac reflected on the further development of the biodiversity movement and community in his book, The Idea of Biodiversity, as follows.
Subjective preferences are packaged with hard facts, eco-feelings are joined to economic commodities, deep ecology is sold as dollars and sent to more pragmatic or more myopic policymakers and members of the public.
This very critical view is interesting in that it anticipated debates we are having today in both biodiversity policy and science quite well. The question of personal preferences, facts, values, and the role of science in communicating a determinate understanding of biodiversity to policymakers and the general public. But let me return to the Convention on Biological Diversity briefly. What are the objectives of the Convention? So the conservation of biodiversity, the sustainable use of its components, but also the regulation of access and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources. This is important because this area of tension between preservation, conservation and use, and also the idea that they have to be distributed globally in order to not only leave the proceeds to countries of the north but also to the south, so that these fields of tensions are still the fields of tension that have a great impact on the Convention. So, alongside the North and the South, the conservation and the use of biodiversity, it's about property rights, and of course it's also about the question how goals should be formulated so that biodiversity can be protected. Since its establishment, the Convention on Biological Diversity has developed a number of goals, such as the IIasa biodiversity targets, which were adopted in 2010 in the framework of the conference in Nagoya, and are intended to achieve progress by 2020 at the next conference of the parties in Kunming, China. The post-2020 targets and the global biodiversity framework are to be adopted, which is to also initiate implementation of a change in the management of biodiversity at an international level. As mentioned at the beginning, talks between the parties took place in Geneva this March on this topic, but they were not very successful. I can tell you that already now, and thus they require a further round of negotiations before the actual COP15 in August in China. A look at the negotiation document and the topics on which states have not yet been able to reach agreement testifies to the inherent conflictual nature of current biodiversity negotiations. So it was not possible to agree on many milestones and indicators that have to be used. There were conflicts as to comprehensive biodiversity monitoring should be designed in the face of unequal distribution of technical infrastructure, especially in countries of the global south. And it was also important to talk about funding. Funding constituted a problem. Many countries of the global north are not ready to make payments so that the global south can contribute to protection measures. This is a topic, of course, that has led to controversies, and also the question of digital sequence information. The question is, should access to these, should this be open, and how should access to this be secured? What has been very interesting about these conferences, and what is also very interesting for our discussion, is that there are different visions on how we can tackle biodiversity loss. Here on the left-hand side, you can see the theory of change vision, which was developed in the framework of the negotiations, a vision that should be established until 2050 in order to be able to live in harmony with nature. You can see this framework, which is currently being negotiated on the one hand, and on the other hand you can also see a poster that was displayed in the framework of these negotiations. And it was presented as a protest campaign by the Global Youth Network in order to show that it's maybe about other things, that it's about a system-wide transformative change, and to acknowledge that we are part of nature. It's about equity, inclusion, human rights, and it's about stopping the way we do biodiversity policy at an international level. And these different visions on biodiversity, so something that is being treated by current institutions, by certain concepts that will be discussed later, or that's something that needs transformative change, they are also discussed in debates of the World Biodiversity Council. So this is my second case in point. I would like to discuss it because it is very important, because it also shows the differences between biodiversity and climate change at the international level. The IPCC, which was adopted in 1992, is based on the IPCC, which has been in existence since 1988 and tries to reach consensus on climate change. The Biodiversity Convention was never based on such a similar intergovernmental body that had made a status report, and the attempt to do this in 1995 by the global assessment was not taken up by policy. So a regular framework was created, but let's talk about the World Biodiversity Council. It was established in 2012. 20 years after the World Biodiversity Council was established, and it took 7 long years of negotiations until states had agreed on establishing such a body. The World Biodiversity Council collects scientific data, analyzes them, and identifies opportunities for political action to protect biodiversity, but the Council itself does not conduct any research. This is very important. Its core task is to prepare reports on the current status and the state of play of knowledge on biological diversity and the services that ecosystems provide for humans. So the concept of ecosystem services as a central column of this World Biodiversity Council and its assessment reports. And for this, the member states of the World Biodiversity Council nominate experts to prepare these reports. The World Biodiversity Council is often compared to the IPCC, which I also did by way of introduction, and indeed there are some parallels. Not only has there been active political and scientific pressure for an IPCC on biodiversity, so which has not been reflected by our policy. So also the way of working when it comes to drawing up the assessment reports and embedding them in international environmental policy, as in the Convention on Biodiversity, is very similar, but there are central differences which are based on science as itself, which have led to many critical voices which were used to position themselves differently. So the common criticism of IPCC at the time was put forward by David Victor, renowned political scientist and author of IPCC reports, in a Nature commentary from 2015. You can see this cartoon here on the right-hand side. If IPCC continues as it is, it will lose its relevance and impact in international climate policy. What Victor means is illustrated by the cartoon you can see on the right-hand side. The consensus orientation of the panel of the IPCC and the avoidance of controversy are in complete contradiction, according to Victor, to the scientific, political and social reality within which climate change is taking place and should be dealt with. Since its inception, in the late 1980s, the IPCC has fostered a tunnel vision, according to Victor, which is reinforced in particular by the lack of social scientists. IPBES, interestingly enough, went through this kind of debate and the question of how tunnel vision could be avoided right at the beginning of its work, and thus the tunnel vision could be avoided, but this has also led to a very complicated debate. Which expertise do we need for biodiversity policy? Which disciplines do we need? Which knowledge do we need? Which experts do we need? And this resulted in a conflict that has been seen as a threat for the legitimacy of IPCC. This was addressed in this article in Nature, which speaks of a battle for the soul of biodiversity. You can see the cartoon that pillories this intergovernmental body. Interestingly enough, and I would like to read it out, is that this battle for the soul of biodiversity has been interpreted as an ideological battle, but this also comes from the fact that many scientists clash with many ideas on what biodiversity is, how it can be reflected, and how it can be regulated politically.
Until now, scientists and conservationists from developed countries have largely led efforts to study and assess species decline. But the decision-making levers within IPBES are now in the hands of scientists who say that conservation efforts need more input from developing countries, from researchers in the humanities and other non-empirical disciplines, and also from non-academics such as farmers, citizen scientists and indigenous peoples. Then geht es weiter. Scientists from less prosperous southern countries have scored off against colleagues from the wealthier north, and researchers from more empirical disciplines are arguing with those from humanities and the social sciences.
So this was in 2018, 4 years ago. Meanwhile, the Council has shown that it is able to publish global assessment reports, and it is also working on bringing together the different visions of biodiversity. How does it do that? You can see it here. So this graphical representation has been a reaction of the World Biodiversity Council to a criticism voiced vis-à-vis the ecosystem services, which had been centrally connected to the term of biodiversity, with the idea to make biodiversity more relevant. So if the economic impact of biodiversity loss could be made quantifiable, if a price tag could be put on it, then political decision makers would direct their attention to this topic and biodiversity policy would be improved. But this conflict in the World Biodiversity Council led to a situation in which a reaction had to happen, and the reaction was that diverse values had to be recognized, not only ecosystem services, anthropocentric values or economic values connected to biodiversity, so relational values, but also the non-anthropocentrical values, intrinsic values that are connected with nature. Nature for nature and not nature for culture or for human beings, a debate that is also reflected in countries such as Bolivia, which had really urged that these monetary values should also be recognized, because in its constitution the rights of nature are also recognized. But this pluralism values is something that is discussed very strongly in the Council, but there is a problem of implementing it and also doing research on it in a scientific way. Now I briefly would like to talk about marine biodiversity. This is important to me, not only because it is a research topic of mine, because the protection of marine biodiversity is currently not covered by the CBD and is not sufficiently protected. So in the marine biodiversity in international waters, 64% of the oceans is not covered, and in order to come up with a regulatory framework, so since 2018, negotiations have been taking place in the framework of the United Nations, trying to come up with a legally binding tool for the establishment of marine protection areas in the high seas in order to measure the human impact on marine biodiversity in the high seas. Think, for example, about deep sea mining. So this plays a very important role here. What is problematic about these negotiations? That there is a lack of a science basis, a scientific basis, and so the UNESCO launched the Marine Decade, which shows that there is a big gap in research. 1 million species have not been described scientifically, and we can assume that 99% of habitats are not covered sufficiently by scientific research. So what we have seen for terrestrial biodiversity, and what we also have as a problem in parts of the global south, has been exacerbated in international waters, and also biometrical studies point to this that I did in the framework of my research project together with my team. We took a look at the global distribution of research publications on marine biodiversity, and we had a sample of 25,000 publications, and we took a look at the number of publications but also at the number of quotations, and you can see here in dark violet all the countries that had a very high scope of marine biodiversity research. And on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, you can see that there are differences as for the topics that are researched. And I cannot go into detail here because this is just an input speech. But what is interesting to see is that in all the regions, the marine biodiversity research is research dealing with genetic diversity, population, species, genetic sequencing, but also increasingly, and this is the third topic here, with environmental management, conservation measures. Taking a look at the different areas, we can see that, so we have two clusters, taxonomy dealing more with genetic sequencing and classic taxonomy. So we can see here very well that distribution here is quite unequal. So in the global north, in Europe, North America, in Australia, classic taxonomy doesn't play a big role in research. It is ever more important in Latin America and makes up for a big part of research. So also this topic here, also this question, who does research, in which disciplines, which kind of knowledge do we need, how can we sustain the disciplines in order to measure marine biodiversity? So all these debates, from my point of view, are inherently important when we talk about the political and scientific challenges. So basically, in all the three cases that I presented, the Convention on the Biological Diversity, the World Biodiversity Council, but also here in the last example, the protection of marine biodiversity at the high seas, it's always about the question, what is the importance of biodiversity for society? It's about conflicts relating to the formulation of goals, milestones as they are called, and indicators. It's about values. It's about conflicting goals, how certain areas can be used in a certain way in order not to do harm to marine biodiversity, but it's also about legitimation mechanisms. How can we legitimize the use of certain scientific knowledge in order to guide political decisions, but it's also about an unequal distribution of biodiversity knowledge and biodiversity data, but also about inadequate observation and monitoring systems. It's not only a problem of the global south, it's also a problem that we have to grapple in Europe in many places. So uniform monitoring of marine biodiversity is not existent, but it would be important. And there is also a difficulty in developing and operationalizing holistic or systemic approaches. But how can they be operationalized? And here I'm also thinking about the work of IIasa in this area, and I'm very excited to hear about the developments that have been made in this respect. So last but not least, and this is something that I consider very important in all the cases, it's also about the question of transformative change, which is claimed not only by GNOs and youth organizations, but also by the World Biodiversity Council itself. How can transformative change be reflected scientifically, and how can it be implemented?
By way of conclusion, I would like to come back to the original hypothesis. It is very important to ensure that the institutions and the political boundary conditions that we have created in order to overcome this crisis should be viewed critically. That's the point I was going to make. But I also believe that the historical and conceptual development of biodiversity policy is important. It's important to understand the history, how it all evolved, and what areas of tensions have developed, and what political interests, what conflicts prevent our efforts. So I've tried to show this by 3 examples. I'm still convinced that I think we also need to talk about facts, terminology, methodologies, existing data infrastructure that make it possible to launch such a decision-making process. And we also need to talk about the intersection and interface between politics and science, how this can be shaped, not in order to prevent a politicization of science. I think that's also important, but we need to have evidence-based politics, and we need to have a political public debate about what preserving biodiversity is worth to us. And I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you, dear Alice. I think in your presentation we saw quite clearly where the challenges lie, and that there are challenges out there. And this was, of course, also part of the title of today's event. We start with the conception, the understanding, what is biodiversity in the first place, and that is not just a number of animals or plant species in a certain area, but actually can be understood in different ways. The distribution of resources, the approach used by science or in the negotiation and finding a consensus can be different. And in the final analysis, we saw that there is also a lack of foundations. And marine biodiversity, as you have well demonstrated, this is no man's land. So sometimes the competencies are not quite clear, who's in charge of what, and that's also the case for terrestrial biodiversity. That's where I know there's huge gaps, and we need to fill those gaps in order to make sure that we can take decisions, and that we can provide decision makers with relevant information to make sure that they can take the right decisions. This takes us to the second part of this evening event. I'm now very pleased to welcome our panelists. I'd like to welcome Steffen Fritz, David Leclerc, Christian Sturmbauer, Alice Vadroux, and Sophie Zechmeister-Boltenstern. I would like to ask you to join us here on the panel, and I will introduce you individually. Let me start by introducing Steffen Fritz. He's sitting closest to me. He's the program director and principal research scholar of the Strategic Initiatives Program of the IIasa. He started his career in England, where he first received his master's degree from the University of Durham and later his PhD from the University of Leeds. After a research stay at the Joint Research Center in Ispra, Italy, his path finally led him to IIasa in Luxembourg. His research interests include Earth observation, citizen science, and the implementation of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I believe that this is a subject that Alice has also referred to in her presentation. We'll come back to the UN SDGs. Steffen has informed me that for many, many years he's been driving to Lake Constance to go sailing with his friends there. And what he noticed is that, as opposed to a couple of decades ago, there are hardly any insects glued to the windscreen of his car after this long journey. And this may sound good and beneficial because he no longer needs to clean his windscreen, but there's a serious background. There's a strong downturn of insects here in Europe, which is dramatic, and such examples go to show that this is really dramatic. Next to him is David Leclerc.
He's a senior research scholar at IIasa's Biodiversity and Natural Resources program. He obtained both his master and PhD degrees at the Paris-Saclay University in France, and he worked for more than 10 years in the areas of land use change, climate change and biodiversity by means of enhancing, applying global scale datasets and models. He is the mastermind behind the Bending the Curve initiative, and we will hear about this in a minute, that brought together more than 60 international experts from 44 institutions to provide scientific expertise for negotiating biodiversity policies on a global level. Believe it or not, he came to this biodiversity topic about 5 years ago, and still he can't provide the scientific name of a single species. Yet, biodiversity matters to him as a make or break component of the future of people and nature. Ich switche wieder
I will switch back to German, and I would like to introduce Christian Sturmbauer. He is professor of zoology and evolutionary biology at the Karl Franzens University in Graz, where he headed both the Department of Zoology and the Department of Biology. He studied zoology at the University of Innsbruck, where he obtained his doctorate and where he later also habilitated. And I think I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that Christian Sturmbauer is a key figure in the Austrian biodiversity community. And I will just name a few of his capacities. He's a member of the Austrian Biodiversity Council, the National Biodiversity Commission, and also a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of Austrian Barcode of Life. You maybe have heard of the acronym ABOL, which aims to inventory the genetic diversity of all animals, plants and fungi in Austria. Furthermore, he's also a vice chairman of the Commission for Interdisciplinary Ecological Studies that we have already heard a lot about here at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And for completeness sake, I would also like to mention that the chairperson of this Commission for Interdisciplinary Ecological Studies, Verena Vinivate, is among the guests here. So a cordial welcome, and also her predecessor, Gerhard Glatzel, who's also sitting in the first row. So I'm very pleased to have them with us tonight. Christian Sturmbauer said quite clearly, if man does not find an answer to this decline of species, the dying out of species, then evolution will find one. Well, I think this is a very profound statement that we should ponder and consider. I already introduced Alice Vadrol previously, but I guess her motto is also important, because in the framework of her research, she did 165 qualitative interviews with decision makers and scientists from the area of biodiversity. These are interviews that take on average 1 hour, so a total of almost 10,000 minutes worth of interviews, or a total of 7 days of 24 hours. And when you transcribe this, it's 1,980 pages of text. So thank you very much for your commitment, and I wish you a lot of strength for the next 10,000 minutes and a lot more. And last but not least, I would like to introduce Sophie Zechmeister-Boltenstern. She is Professor of Soil Science and Soil Microbiology at the Institute of Soil Research at the University of Natural Resources and Applied Life Sciences. She's also heading this institute, and she's also a deputy chairperson of the Department for Forests and Soil Sciences. She is among the most frequently cited experts worldwide. She is in the top of the ranking of people being quoted since 2019. Sophie Zechmeister is also a member of the Institute of Interdisciplinary Ecological Studies here at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. At the scientific lecture, she deals with biodiversity and the function of soil organisms, and here in particular in respect of climate change. She is saying that a handful of soil contains more microorganisms than there are people on this planet. Just consider this. And biodiversity in our soils is much greater than that above ground. So I believe that we have a very interesting panel, and at the outset, before we proceed to the general debate, I would like to start asking a few questions. Let me start with you, Sophie. As your statement has demonstrated, the diversity of species below ground contributes a lot to overall biodiversity, but at the same time this is also the part of biodiversity which is not visible, which is not so well known, which doesn't come to mind when we are talking about biodiversity, because soil microorganisms are of course not as nice as songbirds or butterflies, and we would notice quickly if those were absent. So from the scientific perspective, do we know how important soil biodiversity is for our planet Earth and for us humans? Because there are also some organisms that are also functional. So we're talking about functional biodiversity here. And what are the main causes for the loss of biodiversity in our soils? And do you think that the decision makers take heed of that sufficiently, or do we need to take this into consideration more than we did in the past? Thank you, Victor, for the introduction, and thank you for the presentation. And I would like to start by mentioning the previous presentation. So soil biodiversity is just as badly researched as that of the high seas and the deep oceans. There are numerous species in the taxonomy of the soil that have not yet been researched, but I believe that they are important for our life and all of our lives, because soil biodiversity is decisive when it comes to the production of plants. It even determines the biodiversity above ground. So there are studies that show that the more diverse microorganisms there are in the soil, the more diverse plants can settle in such an area. The soil microorganisms and societies of microorganisms are keeping the nutrient cycles in swing. Otherwise, our forests would have many meters of rotten leaves if they were not decomposed by microorganisms, and the nutrient cycles would also collapse. So these soil organisms are interrelated and closely related to each other. We know this from fungi. There are huge fungi. Fungi are the biggest organisms on this planet, soil-dwelling fungi that, the mycelium is connecting different tree species with each other, and thus also make sure that things are kept in balance, and that also pests are controlled. But the most important thing from my perspective, and this may not be well known, is the climate impact of soil organisms. So soils are huge carbon sinks. So how is the carbon stored? It's stored as humus in the soils. That's a lot more than is stored above ground, and it is also a lot more than what people are emitting into the atmosphere. We are doing very intensive research when it comes to looking at this carbon pump of microorganisms, and globally there are also major efforts underway due to the 4 per mil initiative to increase the humus in soils and thus to tie additional CO2 in the soils in the form of humus. Just consider in a meadow 150 tons of carbon per hectare are stored. a lot less is stored in arable soil. It's maybe 50% of that. So a lot has already been lost due to human intervention. And if you compare this with an Austrian who will emit 7 tons of CO2 per year, and a flight to Vancouver accounts for about 5 tons of CO2. So if we were to adjust this lever and look at the microbial diversity, and if we can manage to tie a little bit more CO2 in soil humus, this will have a big impact on the atmosphere and could help to offset the human emissions, theoretically at least, if this were done globally. Of course, we cannot do this fully, but if we can do it to a lesser extent, this will already be very beneficial. And we would also be doing something to increase the resilience of soils, to make them more resilient against strong rainfalls or droughts. We would do something for the stability of agriculture and for food safety. And now I'll stop. So thank you very much. So the answer is quite straightforward. Soil microorganisms are highly relevant, and you see how relevant this is in terms of biodiversity above ground. I think you've shown the interconnection. I have a question for Alice. In your presentation, you showed quite aptly that these processes of negotiation, these mechanisms, well, they have been around for a long time, and there are perils also in terms of the processes and negotiations in terms of climate change, so that both sides have learned from each other. Apart from the problem of the insufficient data, what I would like to know is whether decision makers and politicians are aware of the problem of the decline of species. Because you said that during the last negotiations there were insufficient results, there are more conflicts, and if people knew how urgent this problem was, and I think this fits in nicely with what Sophie has just said, namely how much CO2 the soils can absorb if there's a healthy biodiversity, if there's a good biome. So I guess in these negotiations this should sound warning bells, because actually we could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So how relevant are those political rules in terms of biodiversity? And maybe let me ask an additional question. Are there any other well-informed scientific channels apart from policymaking, so such as social media and others, where these messages can also be communicated that will maybe induce us to change the way we act? How do you see this? Well, there have been a lot of questions. It is my impression that the biodiversity crisis is being perceived more and better than 15 years ago when I started my research, and when I always had to explain why I'm dealing with the subject in the first place. Why am I not devoting my time to climate change, which is more relevant, but this no longer happens. It is also my impression that there is an awareness when it comes to political decision makers that something needs to be done. Now, if you take a look at this at the international level, well, I would say that there are some conflicts that exist between developing countries and developed countries when it comes to the various capacities of how we can participate in the conservation of biodiversity. But it's also about money, and whenever we're talking about money, it is hard to find an agreement. So what we are seeing in the international arena are things that are have referred to. There is an awareness, but of course the representatives of government are trying to pick out whatever happens to be their priority. And that happens to be biodiversity here, but in many other countries it is not a priority. Now let's move away from the international level and move to the national level. Things are a bit different here at the national level, because the current government is showing that it does constitute an important topic for them. But as we have seen, and this is also emphasized by the core demands of the Biodiversity Council, it is not enough to distribute money by way of subsidies to agriculture, which tends to endanger biodiversity. Yes, there is an awareness out there, but if biodiversity is not thought in conjunction with agriculture, land use, and if we don't come up with a holistic perspective, I believe that biodiversity is always going to lose out because other interests always tend to be more important. And as to the third question, I believe that alternative channels such as social media and also a lot of youth movements such as Extinction Rebellion can contribute to making sure that the younger generations develop an awareness whether that is sustainable and whether those will be the future voters who will be voting for the parties that are standing up for the protection of biodiversity remains to be seen, but that is at least my hope. But we'll see. Okay, thank you very much. You mentioned something that I would like to emphasize, this holistic, systemic approach. And I believe that that fits tonight's context very well, and we are going to hear more on that from IIasa, because this is actually their core business. Christian, you represent also the predecessor organization that started in 1947 to publish the Catalogus Faunae Austria, so all the national animal species in Austria. And still, this task is not completed yet, and there are ever bigger challenges. So I have seen today on the news that the 50,000th spider species has been described scientifically. You may have seen it in the news. So the first of these 50,000 spiders was described in 1757, so more than 265 years of history of describing animal species, and still we have only described 50% of all spiders out there. So what are the biggest challenges in your mind from the scientific perspective in terms of laying the foundations of conserving biodiversity?
So it's very, very difficult to give a brief answer. I will try to show you three perspectives. So firstly, over the last decades, science has evolved so fast that the methods of documentation, of description have changed fundamentally. And from this has resulted the fact that traditional descriptions have lost in value because molecular methods have proven their worth as being very, very efficient, very fast, and have established themselves very quickly. But on the other hand, we have seen that at the end of the day, biological knowledge about the structures of the fauna, of the flora, and of fungi are determined by classical methods. And this shows the field of tension of a modern documentation. It's very important to consider these aspects of taxonomy and to connect them with each other. So much for the first point. As for the second point, I would like to stress, so if we were to accept an estimate, so we have 8 to 9 million species on our planet. Maybe this estimate is wrong, but I think in terms of the order of magnitude, it's okay. So 2 million species have been described, and of these 2 million species, 1 million is deemed as endangered. So we taxonomists, we biologists, so we lag behind biodiversity. We try to decode biodiversity as long as it is around. If we consider these hazard situations, and of course there is also a certain level, a certain important level. Species play an important role in quantitative and in qualitative terms, but of course, they make up for more than the sum of their parts. And this is why this ecological system is so important for biodiversity research. And we taxonomists working in a biological or molecular fashion have to increasingly grapple with this problem, and we have to follow a molecular approach. We are not so much talking about the decline of species, but even more about tipping points and what is acceptable for ecosystems until they finally reach the tipping point. Thank you very much, Christian.
David, you are highly acknowledged, and I mentioned it earlier, a study, Bending the Curve, clearly shows that a holistic systems-based approach is needed. And this is what Alice said, this is what Christian, and basically also what Sophie mentioned before. Such a holistic approach is absolutely necessary. So what has to be done in order to actually bend this curve, in order, or in other words, to restore the loss of biodiversity, and what will happen if we do not take any action? Can you set the frame a bit on the challenge? How much and how fast are we losing biodiversity, and to what extent is this reversible, and in which time horizons? Could you enlighten us a bit on this? I know huge topics, but...
Thank you, Victor, for the introduction.
First of all, I would like to apologize, so my German is not good enough.
So, as I said, I'm not very good at naming species, in contrary to my left colleague, if I would see one in the street or in the nature. But what I do is working with models and scenarios to look at the future, and I did that for quite a while already. And this is my main experience with biodiversity so far, and also with the science to policy interface. And I would like to tell you two experiences that I went through recently, two global modeling efforts that were spurred by IPBES mostly. So the first one involved a large community of experts across the continent, and was looking at scenarios that were actually borrowed from the climate community, which is actually much more advanced in using models and scenarios to look at the future. And the main outcome from all the scenarios analyzed was that if you look at the impacts of land use change in the future, so basically how much land we would need for what we eat, for all types of other needs that would come upon us. If you look at land use change impacts only one scenario, the most, let's say, positive scenario in terms of sustainability trends, would allow to bend the curve and reverse global losses in biodiversity. If you add climate change on top of it, none of the scenarios actually succeeded in bending the curve. Doesn't mean that this is the end of the story. And the second, but it's still yielding a very important point, we have a very small window to bend the curve, and bending the curve will also necessitate to bend the curve on climate change. That's the first precondition. And the second experience I was involved with was related to modeling again the effect of biodiversity of future scenarios through land use change, and only land use change, not climate. But this time we looked at new scenarios that were exploring more ambitious action towards bending the curve, and we looked at piling different types of ambitions. And in this type of modeling, you could see scenarios where you actually succeed in bending the curve by 2050, but only for the most ambitious scenarios. And that also told us a little bit more about how to get there. And I think the main lesson to be learned from that exercise is that being more ambitious on conservation and restoration will not do it. We have to go a step further and really address the indirect causes of biodiversity loss. That means, very concretely, changing what we eat and this type of choices. So really going to the lifestyle choices. And that means that we need really to go for a transformational change approach. Just doing more of protected areas and restoration will not do it. That's the two main lessons that are learned from these global modeling exercises with scenarios.
Yeah, so it needs really a drastic change. Und Steffen, eine Frage für dich.
Steffen, one question to you. You are an expert for citizen science, Bürgerwissenschaften in German. So the integration of non-scientific expertise by the embedding of interested laypersons, which is a very promising, a very novel concept. So I came across a study some days ago, and it ties in nicely with marine biodiversity about we heard, and it has been shown that photos of private divers in combination with traditional scientific approaches, that is, photographs taken on a scientific basis, yield a much better result and a much more accurate description of the situation of reef fish than the traditional approach. So here, citizen science can be extremely valuable. The private photos of private divers can be extremely valuable. Another example is recently we have heard that there is a global citizen science-based recording of butterflies that has just been started. However, the question remains as to how reliable this additional information is. How can we maintain quality standards? How can we ensure them? And what role can citizen science play in biodiversity conservation? And maybe you could enlighten us a little bit. Yes, thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for the invitation. I have to apologize for my German, but I will try to speak German because I originally come from Germany, but I'm speaking English a lot. I think it's a very important question. How is it possible to get citizens on board, to get youth on board, to contribute to science, and how can science be made more democratic? And this is also closely connected to the social change that we have to drive, that has to do with lifestyle changes, as David has formulated it. Everything is connected to everything, and it's very important that science collaborates closely and communicates closely with citizens, and that citizens are also embedded in science. And this happens via different projects, like, for example, the collection of data. This is the traditional method of citizen science, but in future this could also happen via other modes, so that citizens represent their problems themselves and they establish and develop the hypothesis themselves. But to come back to my original example, so if you go to Lake Constance, for example, if you go to the province of Styria or elsewhere, and if no insects are glued to the windscreen anymore, so this is something that has become very pronounced in the last 30 years. There is a very interesting study by the Insect Association in Krefeld, Germany. They did a 27-year study where conservation areas in North Rhine-Westphalia were investigated over the space of 27 years. They started in 1989, and they have seen that insects and the biomass of insects over the space of these 27 years has declined by 75%. And this association is not only made up of professional scientists, zoologists, but it is also made up of citizen scientists. And I think it's highly interesting that this very interesting study, which is also being taken up by politics and also spread by the media, that this has been a study that has been implemented together with citizen science. And here on this graphical representation, you can also see that meanwhile there are many apps where citizens can contribute to the collection of data on certain species, where they are mapped, and at the same time they are also documented. And for example, here you can see very well the data that are fed into the global diversity information system. So we have more data coming from regular citizens than from professional scientists, and they mainly come from eBird and from iNaturalists. And this is also the study that you have just presented, the study by Christopher Roberts on biodiversity and conservation, where you can see this complementarity between citizens and scientists using iNaturalists data. So we can see that there is a huge amount of data, up to 1.3 billion data, occurrence data, that is, data relating to species. And I think it really goes to show that there is a huge potential that can be unearthed when it comes to embedding citizens. And interestingly enough, these data are used in order to do reporting on SDGs. For example, there is goal number 15, life on land. There are 169 of these targets and 144 pertinent indicators. So we have 15.41 covering of different sites for important protection areas in mountainous areas. And here also data coming from citizens are embedded. For example, 15.51 red list species. Here, GP's data are used in order to implement the reporting coming, for example, from BirdLife International. So I only want to show how important this topic will become in the future and how important it will be to embed the data coming from citizens in the future. So I think we've reached a point where we can also open up the discussion and include the audience. I know we are in a time crunch, but we started late, and I think you will forgive us. So now you have the opportunity to ask questions on site. Please raise your hands, and there is someone with a roving microphone for everyone participating online. So below the stream window there is a field where you can enter your question, and it will appear here, and I can hand it over to the panel. I would like to ask the audience and also the panelists to formulate their questions as concisely as possible, so that we can cover as many topics as possible. So I can see the first question here in the back. My name is Volker Mohrer. I'm a university professor in Sweden. I also was a coordinating author for climate science, and I will also taught at International UN University in Japan. The new framework that is now being developed has also been mentioned, bending the curve. In the new framework, there is some very important information net gains for nature. So in future, we have to give back to nature more than we take out of nature. And this is a very new approach under the sun, because meanwhile we have only talked about halting the development, but now the approach has become more ambitious. So from the point of view of you panelists, what would be approaches that we could use to implement it? The European Union has also started with that, with the circular economy strategy, with the biodiversity strategy, but what could be concrete approaches to implement these net gains? Let's talk about net gains. Who wants to take this question? Sophie, maybe? Thank you very much for this question. So, as a soil scientist and And in view of humus and soil, well, this is a topic that we have been working on. So we try to shed light on humus, and humans have degraded humus a lot. So we try to improve the situation by greening measures, by mixed cultures, by circular economy measures, by a different type of agriculture, giving more leeway to organisms, by way of less working of the soil, for example. And this leads to a situation where we can give back more to nature than we take out of nature. This is theoretically possible and is also used in ad campaigns by the HIP company, for example. Thank you very much. I would like to take a question from the internet, or maybe two questions. Would like to combine two questions from the internet. So what is the Biodiversity Council? And this is the core of the question. Does it have an advisory function for the government? And secondly, what does the federal government, what do the provinces contribute to biodiversity in Austria? Maybe you can sketch it out briefly. You might have heard that 3 years ago, a group of scientists, environmental activists have started dealing with this topic, and they came together to form the Biodiversity Council. And after the elections to the new council, we have 21 new members contributing complementary knowledge, know-how, and we also want to offer consulting services to policymakers. The decision-making structures in Austria differ from other countries, and real integration is rather problematic. So we are rather interested in collaborating closely with those structures. And this does not only apply to the Biodiversity Council, but also, for example, to the Austrian Academy of Sciences. The role that we want to play is an offer that we want to make to policymakers, but on the other hand, of course, we also want to foster interaction with Austrian stakeholders so that we raise awareness for the problem. So we have different strategies. We have a barometer. So once a year, we describe measures and we assess expert measures, and we say either it goes in the right direction or we deviate from the right direction, and thus we give feedback. Of course, this has not been highly constructive, and this is why we would like to develop in a direction where there is stronger embedding in decision making. Thank you very much. Albert has the next question for us.
Thank you. It's something that's been worried me for a long time, and I know my team will get angry at me for asking this again. But I think it's one of the key things that worry me about biodiversity. 2 million out of 8 million species described, and I think you're discounting the soil microbes in that number in any way. My concern is by the time we've actually gone through this process of describing species, we will know exactly what we should have done because it'll all be gone. But what we can do is we have a very good understanding of turnover, species turnover in space, in different kinds of ecosystems, in different kinds of environments. But we can model species, what we think there is, based on very sound assumptions and putting together global models of biodiversity that we can work with from a policy perspective in the interim while we go about the quantification and the process of confirming or either altering the assumptions based that these models are based on. Is there any work going on in that space? In other words, something that will fast-track our understanding and our policy-making decisions in a way that will hopefully make our efforts more impactful in the short term.
I think this is a very important question because it basically addresses one of the major challenges science has at the moment. Biodiversity crisis, and actually it's the 6th mass extinction, as it is called, because we are meeting the 3 criteria that we have rapid climatic changes ongoing at the moment, we have a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we have high ecological stress in all the ecosystems we see. And so it's a matter of efficiency to monitor and to get feedback loops into the decision-making process. And for traditional biologists, this is exactly the challenge that I basically wanted to pinpoint in my initial statement, that on the one hand, we need the knowledge about individual species, how they interact in ecosystems in order to be able to model. On the other hand, we are certainly not going to be fast enough in order to make these to increase the understanding about the processes to such an extent that we are adequately addressing issues that are needed in political decisions. So I think this is the challenge, and we certainly need to increase the monitoring aspects.
Zwei weitere Kommentare zuerst von
There are 2 further comments from Elise and then from David. Yes, that was the very argument that Wilson put forward in the framework of this conference.
The kind of argument that Edward O. Wilson made. So we have to stop thinking about how much we know, how can we measure. We have to go a step further. But what I see is that this has an impact on how the science is done. So I think you have artificial intelligence, you have environmental DNA, you have integration of spatial data. I mean, I think this has really transformed biodiversity research. The other point I wanted to make is that I think we don't have to prove that the biodiversity crisis exists, and maybe this is a bit different from climate change. In climate change, it took like years and years and years to prove that there is climate change, and I think with biodiversity it's a bit different. But the question is, how can you need the local knowledge. You need it to be able to regulate ecosystems or to manage them efficiently. So I think that this local aspect of biodiversity is also different from climate change in a way.
David?
Thank you. Just a small counterpoint. So I fully agree that we should develop innovative ways of building models and complementing the data gaps that we have. I think that's a very promising research avenue. But this is probably, as been pointed by Alice, not necessarily the main lever to really acting on biodiversity. It's like you are running probably too fast, and you know that there is a wall somewhere in front, but there is some fog. So you are looking at ways to kind of get to know information within this fog, but you already know in any case that you will have to break. And that is something that we need to work on, and probably can achieve a lot just by doing that.
I have an example, a practical example, the City Nature Challenge, as it is called. It's an international citizen science project. The point is the following. It is not really widely known in the countryside, and there's hardly any advertising. The rural population seems not to deal too much with the loss of biodiversity. Everything's still green, everything's still alive after all. So how can we remedy this deception? So in other words, how can you convince the rural population that we are losing biodiversity? I don't think they're even ignoring the issue, but possibly there are different kinds of perception from rural dwellers and urban dwellers. Yes, that certainly does constitute a challenge. It is an issue. So I believe that what is important is to make sure that we also need to communicate the global perspective. So a lot of communication is needed here. And if you take a look at the global biodiversity situation, 2/3 of biodiversity is in the tropics. And, well, we have not stopped the destruction of rainforests. In Brazil, there's the highest level of destruction in 15 years. And I think the rural population will also be flabbergasted when they understand what dramatic consequences there are. And this takes me back to what David said. Our own consumption, our own way of life has a strong impact. And we are very strongly networked at a global level. And I think this is something that we can also communicate to the population in the countryside, just like the population in the big cities. I think a lot has to do with the fact that we need to start teaching this in schools. We need to raise awareness among students and young pupils how important soil diversity is. So if they live in the countryside and if they see that they're losing humus, and they have lost a lot of humus already, and the students are trained to see that it's not only about having a nice green landscape, but it's also about the thickness of the humus layer, and that they themselves are capable of measuring the layer of humus on the soil. So they have the tools in hand in order to be able to generate this data. I think we all agree when it comes to education and training. I have a question in the third row and in the second row. I would like to ask two questions, if I may. I'm always surprised that when it comes to the climate debate and also the biodiversity debate, that the main problem, at least from my perspective, is not even mentioned in keywords, namely the overpopulation of this planet. Occasionally people are saying in a relaxed manner that in 2050 we'll have 10 billion people living on this planet, as if it were just easy peasy. But in 1950, 70 years ago, a book was written about the population explosion. Back then we had 3 billion inhabitants. Now we stand at 8 billion. 10 billion was accepted, and then there are speculations that the population figures might go down. But the fact that this is the root cause of this entire problem is not mentioned with a single word. So that's the first point. My second point is there an international body? Of course, there are national bodies in terms of raw material diversity, because you know that back then the Club of Rome, and that's decades back, also started by talking about the problem of raw materials. Before we had the climate debate and before we had the biodiversity debate, it was the raw materials problem that was discussed. Will we have enough raw materials in future? We are discussing a lot about lithium, for example. This is just one example. So my question is, are there any discussions surrounding the diversity of raw materials? Who would like to refer to that? Stefan? Well, let me refer to the first question, the overpopulation, the increase of global population. I think this is an incredibly important topic, and we don't always turn a blind eye to it. In the models that David has, it is taken into account, but I believe that it is not only the number of people on this planet, but what's really important is what those people consume, how much they consume, and what they eat. That makes a huge difference. There's a difference in terms of the impact on biodiversity and also on emissions. Let's say if you eat beef, you have a certain amount of protein. If you consume this protein through peanuts, you emit 100 times less. This is just one example. And at the same time, the impact on biodiversity will be dramatically reduced. So we can reduce the pressure on arable land. And in Africa, for example, the average yield is 0.5 tons per hectare. And in Europe, it's 8 tons per hectare when it comes to wheat. And in Africa, for example, by giving them some input, you can increase the yields of agriculture. And that is one of the approaches that we should be pursuing. Sophie would like to come in? Yes, I would like to agree. Let me quote an example from Austria. Austria is a European champion when it comes to land use and sealing of land. Well, the population has increased by 10% in the past 30 years, but the consumption of land has increased by 30%. So this is also due to people's lifestyle. Another thing that is quite interesting at the global level, and this refers to the raw material situation, but also what these raw materials are turned into. Globally speaking, there are more buildings and more infrastructure than living biomass. Globally speaking, there is more plastics than animals. And in Austria, the situation is even more dramatic, and I think that is already saying a lot. Let me add to this. I believe that you're right in saying that the population development, the demographic development, is of course closely correlating with the problems that we're experiencing. The increasing level of industrialization that started in the 17th or 18th century, with this increased consumption of resources that goes with it, is another correlation. And that, of course, induces climate change. So I believe that both things need to be considered. Alice? I didn't mention this, but the World Biodiversity Council is addressing this subject. They're talking about direct and indirect drivers. So direct drivers would be things such as agriculture, and indirect drivers would be demographic trends or technological development. And that constitutes progress, the fact that we consider those things as well. The last but one question.
For these insights, what has not been mentioned and what makes me a little bit less enthusiastic about believing in education and if people only knew is that the evidence that that actually helps is very, very, I would say at least controversial, or there's very little evidence that knowing more actually makes you behave better on a global level. What the global goals say, the Sustainable Development Goals say, is that the levers, the big levers, are curbing inequality and responsible consumption and production. And I would turn that around and say responsible production and consumption, which I always find very irritating, is that it's consumption first. But I think that addressing these super wicked problems of global inequality, and I was wondering if that shouldn't be a priority here, and if that couldn't be also in your models. I don't know, you said it, you need them very ambitious, but do you actually do something about inequality in them? And can you show that curbing inequality would help biodiversity?
That's definitely a problem that is still to be more explored. But the way we approach it for now is through two ways. So inequalities across regions in the world. And of course, we have scenarios about the extent to which there is convergence in terms of economic trends and socioeconomic status across regions of the world. And behind that, you have a lot of questions related to how we share efforts across nations to reach either a climate or a biodiversity goal. And of course, increasingly, we are pushing this, and also I think we are coming on that path through from a certain data and modeling status, and we're improving our gaps slowly over time. We're increasingly moving towards within nation inequalities, and there is for sure a huge margin to a huge leverage point there. And it's also strongly aligned with other aspects of the SDGs. So fully agree with you.
Danke. Ladies and gentlemen, Damen und Herren, wir haben das.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are faced with the following problem. There are lots of questions coming in, and I'm sure that the people in the audience also have some questions, but we are already past our time limit. So the way we're going to handle this is that the people here on site, I would like to invite you cordially to continue the discussion during our reception. Panelists will stay here, and those who have asked questions via the chat that have not yet been answered, well, we have your questions, and I will pass on your questions to the panelists, and these will then be answered, and I hope I can count on your support for this. And these questions, or the answers rather, will then be published on the website. There is one final question, don't worry, and I would also like to say that this event has been recorded, and the recording will be provided on our homepage in 2 weeks at the latest, in German as well as in English. Now the final question, and this is a question that came in via the web from Michael Lohmeier from Die Presse. Actually, there are two questions. I would like to pick out one question because it is quite suitable, and I would like to ask all our panelists to provide us with a short answer. So what are the main factors that lead to a decline of species and biodiversity? I would like to ask you for a brief answer from your own perspective. Sophie, please do start. Well, from the perspective of soil, I can tell you that the protection of biodiversity and biodiversity of plants, insects, and soil microbes, because a lot of insects are larvae in the ground, and we need to protect the habitat first and foremost. So what this means is that there are various levels how you can protect soil biodiversity by, for example, reducing the consumption and sealing of soils. That is a major risk. And when it comes to land consumption, we need to look at what kind of soil are we talking about. There are some plots of land that are under a lot of pressure, and these are often the most fruitful ones. And this is where we have the greatest biodiversity. So they're valuable in terms of that. The second level is the level of land use. So from my perspective, what this means is, let's take forest and grassland being turned into arable land, and this is something we've been doing for 10,000 years now. Then you also lose biodiversity. A lot of biodiversity also in terms of fungi. And I think we need to protect our forests, we need to protect our grassland and moors and peats. And the third level would be the management. For example, in the area of agriculture and grassland, but also, well, there are numerous approaches how we can promote biodiversity. The frequency of cutting of grass or using fertilizer, and compared to industrial agriculture, we can also have a soil conserving type of agriculture. There are many approaches coming from farmers. There's an association called Bodenleben, Soil Life, with more than 300 members, and they are becoming active themselves of their own accord. So they already are suggesting solutions. Alice? Well, I think there is a low political priority for that. There are conflicting interests, and biodiversity tends to lose out. I would like to give you a more emotional answer. I spent 8 hours in the Austrian Biodiversity Commission, and we're in the process of defining the biodiversity strategy until 2030 here in Austria. During the meeting of this body, the Chamber of Agriculture posted a press release whereby the biodiversity strategy was endangering the food safety here in Austria. And I was among those individuals in this body who stood up and protested against the statement, because that was a meeting with the obligation of secrecy, and this is an ongoing procedure. And basically, I believe that it is especially those conflicting targets that Alice has referred to are the very point that our politicians need to overcome. We need a multifactorial approach, and various areas need to work hand in glove. And I think this can be best explained by the land consumption situation. We are faced with a situation that is quite unique, and in Styria, I believe the situation is even worse than in the rest of Austria. We have we're losing 20 football fields of soil. This land is sealed up every day. And when we discuss this, it is those conflicting interests and also decision-making conflicts that lead to the fact that nothing is going to change. Communal taxes are paid by industrial enterprises, and these help the communities and municipalities. And these communal taxes maybe help just one municipality and not several. So maybe we could change the structure and achieve a situation whereby we would reconsider, and maybe we would not really focus so much on the interests of individual communities and municipalities when it comes to land use. So this one example goes to show that now we really need to tackle this, and this requires goodwill from all parties and the readiness to leave the trodden paths of the way we did things in the past. This is, of course, innovative, but also harbors certain risks, but that is the challenge that we need to assume and that we need to communicate to politicians. Thank you, Christian, for this very topical and practical insight that you have given us. There is one online reaction to this. Let me read this. Oh my God.
Biodiversität fördert die Ernährung.
So biodiversity promotes food safety and security. Okay. Well, of course, we know this. David.
Just to take it maybe again to the global scale and to the future. So we have been talking a lot about the European context. There are other regional environments where the threats are different. And it's also important to talk about oceans, for example, where overexploitation is maybe more important than sea use. And climate change in the future is something which will become really increasingly a big problem for biodiversity. And to an extent that we don't really master well, but it is really a strong driver of change for the next decades to come. That's something to mention. And I would also like maybe to go back to frame what would be blocking a better future for biodiversity. I think this is mainly about getting to understand better what is it in there for us in that world where biodiversity is doing better, and how to share the efforts to get there at all types of scales. I think these are the two most important questions. And it goes back to the conflicts that Alice was mentioning.
Ja, and last but not least, Steffen.
Dankeschön. Wenn man sich die globale
Steffen, last but not least, taking a look at the global statistics related to the loss of biodiversity, then at the moment, so climate is a factor that plays a role to an extent of 6%. So climate change will have a drastic impact on biodiversity, and 50% applies to land use or land use change, and globally speaking, this is the biggest problem. So we can see it in Austria with the sealing of surfaces, the extension of agriculture in the tropics. But can we do? This is the big question. In Europe, it's about the application of pesticides, which is a huge problem in Europe. But the big question is, what can we do? This is something that is becoming ever more pronounced. It's about the renaturation of the earth, rewilding, afforestation, the afforestation of native species. This harbors a big potential, and at the same time, this also improves biodiversity and also has a positive impact on the climate. To name just a few examples. Thank you very much. Thank you. So an answer to your question has come in. I want to share it with you. The UNEP Resource Panel deals with the question of resources. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of today's event. I think we could talk about these topics at length, and you, the participants on site, will have the opportunity to talk about these topics during the reception. I would like to thank our panelists. Alice, for your keynote presentation. Thank you very much for your contributions. Dear audience, I would like to thank you very much. I would like to thank the audience present here. I would like to thank the online audience. The interest in these topics has been hardly on the wane. We have seen an excellent overview, and now I would like to give the floor to Christoph. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I will try to be very brief. I would like to thank everyone who has been on the panel. I would like to thank the visitors on site. I would also like to thank Viktor Bruckmann for the excellent organization, as always. So in closing, I would like to say the following on the loss of biodiversity, also in terms of insects. So something that has not been mentioned today, but which is also dear to my heart in my function as deputy head of the Astronomy Commission, and this is light pollution, because also light pollution makes a seminal contribution to this problem, and we have to bear the blame for this. So if you want to know who is behind biodiversity loss, so you will find the next mirror if you think about the topic of light pollution.